The story is about a young man named Klein. In his past life, he was killed but miraculously reborn. Now he is investigating the world of magic to find out how this happened. His only clues are an old diary with mysterious entries that he has to decipher. The guy's mind was filled with different thoughts. The voices in his head fought with each other, not understanding what was happening. As soon as he opened his eyes, the young man looked at himself and felt every cell in his body. And it was hard for him to control himself and collect his thoughts. As soon as he woke up, he asked himself if he had finally woken up or if he was still in a deep and terrible dream. His hand rested on the floor, trying to lift his cottony and heavy body to get a better look at the place where he was. Rising to his feet, the young man grabbed his head, not understanding why it hurt so badly, as if hundreds of knives were piercing it. As soon as he started to come to his senses and looked around the place more closely, he was overcome with panic and confusion about where he was, because he had never been in that room before. He stood in the middle of a small room, all alone, constantly asking himself the same thing. What kind of unfamiliar place was this, and where was he? Having mastered his body and thoughts, his eyes examined everything. The first thing he noticed was a wooden, unfamiliar table with a few books and weapons on it. Next, he noticed a dark and gloomy room with a wooden bed, but with fresh linens. And he thought that they had prepared for him and had everything ready. After analyzing the bed and the table, the young man wondered where he could be. Perhaps it was a place where he had already been, but he just didn't remember. Although the boy had never complained about his memory and attention, there was a dead silence in the room. Suddenly, the young man was attracted to a huge window with a full moon in the sky, which with its red color blinded the boy's eyes, and the light fell on the gloomy bedroom. And then even more thoughts flooded his head. His pupils enlarged, and his gaze hung in one place, thinking and putting all the puzzles together. And suddenly, as if everything began to fall into place, he realized that he was slowly beginning to understand, and his guesses were confirmed. Turning around, he saw a large, full-length mirror. The boy walked up to it and looked at himself carefully. It was as if he was speechless when he saw himself. A second later, he came to and leaned more closely to the mirror, and his mouth seemed to say his name. The young man remembered everything about himself, but still not believing what he was seeing, he asked his reflection if he really saw Zhou Ming Rui in front of him. The guy kept looking at the reflection and asking himself various questions. He could not understand how it happened, that he could be reborn into another person. Zhou went through every book he had read, every short story he had studied, but no such situation was described in any work. How he was able to be reborn was one thing he could not understand. He realized that he needed to calm down and get a grip on himself, because in this state, he would not be able to solve the riddle. He breathed in and out 3 times to calm himself and focus on the problem. He remembered that he hadn't had much luck lately, and that was when the guy quit his job. Walking down the street, he passed a vendor selling old books, and then Zhou thought about buying him one of those books. It turned out to have spells in it, and that's what got him interested. After flipping through the book, he found a certain spell that he decided to implement and recite. He placed the food in the 4 corners of the room and began to perform a ritual to improve his luck. Without finishing the ritual, the young man threw the book on the floor and realized that nothing had changed. He finally realized that it was all nonsense and that all these tricks would not help solve his problems. He stood in the middle of the room and thoughts flooded his head. He realized that perhaps thanks to the ritual he could be reborn after all, and it happened again. Once again, this unbearable headache did not allow me to consciously think and consider everything that was done to the young man. It was as if he had plunged back into the trance he had experienced before. He was overwhelmed by a multitude of thoughts and memories that captured his attention. The young man found himself in a room with many books that interested him. He sat down close to them and began to leaf through each one to find at least some answers. And then an interesting wrapper caught his attention. The guy was flipping through and carefully reading every letter. And suddenly, he read an inscription addressing the boy in big, bold letters. It said that his real name was Klein Moretti. And then the boy began to remember everything. He saw everything as if it were real. It was little Klein Moretti and his girlfriend, who lived in the kingdom of Lowen, namely in the city of Tingen, Ava County. They grew up together and grew to the age when they were already handsome young men who walked along cozy streets, discussing various topics of interest to teenagers. His father was once a sergeant in the Royal Army, where he sacrificed his life during fierce battles in the conflict with the southern continent. Klein considered him a hero and always looked up to him. After the loss of his father, the boy was very worried about his future because it was his father who was the family breadwinner and provided all the expenses. And when the time came for him to enter a private gymnasium, the state paid the family a financial aid, and his mother was an incredible fan of the goddess of the eternal night. This meant that it was at night that all the potential of the person and all the skills that the young man's mother had woke up. But this did not last long, and she also died while Klein was taking his exams to enter a higher education institution. It was a huge loss for the young man. He realized that he had no support left and became a complete orphan. After the funerals of both parents, he was left all alone in a 2-room apartment with his older brother, who provided for the children, and his younger sister. This was the greatest support and consolation after the double loss. Klein studied hard. As a graduate, he was very proficient in the ancient language, which was considered the oldest of all languages on the entire southern continent. Of all the languages he learned, Klein knew best the language of Hermes, which was associated with prayers and spells, sacrifices, and appeared very often on ancient tombstones. Suddenly, he realized that this knowledge of the language would help the boy in solving the complicated story that was happening in his life. Klein quickly looked around the room at where he was, floating in his thoughts, and realized that he needed to find the notebook with the boy's notes. After all, there might be answers to all the riddles. He quickly began flipping through the pages of his diary and eventually found an entry that clearly and concisely stated that everyone would die, including himself. And then he really thought about these words. He read everything over and over again, thinking about every word and every phrase because it all sounded very strange and scary. When Klein ran his finger across the sheet, he saw that there were dirty marks on the snow-white paper. He did not understand what had happened to his hands. The young man took a closer look at them and everything that could have stained his hands, and then he thought that it was the ink from the notebook that could have given the color. But it was strange, because the diary was old, so he dismissed the idea. Suddenly, Klein realized that there was no red ink in the notebook, and his hands were covered in a dark burgundy color. Could it be blood? The young man went back to the mirror and kept looking at his reflection, feeling an unbearable pain in his head. It was as if thousands of hammers were constantly pounding on his temples. Suddenly, he saw a slow stream of blood running down his face. As he came closer, the young man pushed his hair behind his ear and became petrified. He could not say a word at what he saw. He had a large and bloody hole in his temple. It was a walnut-sized bullet wound. He did not remember how it happened at all. The petrified and bewildered young man stood there looking at the blood moon that completely illuminated the room. He was running through all the possibilities in his head, how this could have happened, but unfortunately, nothing came to mind. As soon as he regained consciousness, he began to think seriously. Is it really possible to stay alive after such a severe injury, since this injury was caused by a firearm? Klein did not know a single case where a person survived such an injury and could still think objectively. He decided to touch the wound with trembling hands and carefully examine it. And as soon as he did, he was seriously frightened. How could this have happened? After all, the wound was already half healed and dried up. But how is this possible? The guy had this thought that maybe he was already dead, and he was imagining all this. He carefully examined every inch of his body in front of the mirror. Klein even decided to pinch or hit himself to make sure he was alive and conscious. The young man even suggested that perhaps this effect was due to the rebirth of his body. He did not stop thinking about this mysticism, because no book had ever described it. But one more question did not leave him alone. How did it happen that he was still alive and didn't remember being allegedly killed by someone? Or maybe he was injured during the battle, like his father. Klein recalled that when he looked at the diary, he found a weapon that could have killed him. The guy walked over to the table where it was lying and began to study it carefully. It was an old gun with rust on the muzzle. He walked closer and picked it up to examine every inch of it and find at least some clue. When he spun the drum in the gun, bullets fell out, but one was missing. And again, the puzzle began to take shape little by little. Klein realized that this was the diameter of the hole in his temple, and that was the one bullet missing from the gun. It might have killed the boy. He couldn't stand still and kept stumbling around, and suddenly he felt something hard under his shoe. He sat down to see what it was, and the bullet that had wounded him was lying on the floor. It was covered in blood. The young man carefully took it in his hands and looked at it carefully. And then his thoughts could not be stopped. He realized that he had died from a firearm, but he did not understand whether it was suicide or murder. But he pulled himself together and realized that his family was very poor and could not have such a weapon, because even the gas lamp on the table was very expensive, and his brother Benson could not buy it. Klein began to get nervous and slammed his palm down on the book, because he did not understand where he had gotten the money for such an expensive revolver. The guy suggested that he could have been killed after all. Could a graduate of the history department have caused someone discomfort? Klein decided to freshen up and went to the bathroom and turned on the cold water. He did not understand how he could be reborn into another body, but fragments of his past life remained. The guy quickly washed his face and started thinking about everything from the beginning, but his body was weak. He didn't even want to clean the floor of blood. The young man moved into the room and took the weapon in his hands to examine everything again. But behind the door he heard very strange sounds, as if someone was walking. Suddenly he heard a voice behind him. He was incredibly frightened and threw the weapon out of his hands. It was his sister, Melissa. Klein quickly hid the weapon behind his back and pretended that he had taken his father's watch and was trying to wind it. The girl didn't understand what was happening and looked at her brother with contempt, while Klein tried to hide the weapon in a drawer without being seen. Melissa did see it and asked the boy to tell her everything. She held out her hand and made it clear that she needed to see what he was hiding. Klein pretended he didn't understand. He asked his sister again what exactly she wanted to see, because he was holding a watch that was not working. He held out his hand with the watch and handed it to Melissa. When the girl picked up the antique, she immediately realized that she had seen it somewhere before. It turned out to be their dad's. She decided to fix it because she knew how to do it. Klein confided in his sister, even though she was only 16 years old. But she was already well versed in such things because she was a student at the steam engine department of the technical school. Her dream was to become a mechanic. After a short wait, Melissa handed the repaired watch to her brother. Klein was very surprised because he did not expect his little sister to be an adult and to know about such things. The young man was very excited because he had not expected to see a working machine. He thanked Melissa and could not contain his joy. At the same time, the girl was peeking around the corner, looking at her older brother. She seemed to be embarrassed by the boy's behavior, and he seemed to her to be mentally ill. She decided that Klein needed help, so she decided to feed him. This was also considered therapy. The girl took out the still warm buns from the bag and treated her brother to some. Melissa also asked the young man to buy some groceries, as he had a job interview in the coming days. She decided to cook his favorite lamb stew with vegetables. Although Melissa was the younger sister, she took custody of her brother. But Klein still remembered his ritual, and he realized that even if he fulfilled his sister's request to buy groceries, it didn't mean he could perform another ritual to improve his luck. Suddenly he heard strange sounds in the room. It was as if the phone was ringing and vibrating loudly. Klein did not understand where the sound could have come from. He started looking in different places. On his desk, on his bed, and even under it. But it was nowhere to be found. Suddenly, under his arm, he felt the sound that was going around the room. He carefully tried to get it out from under the blanket. And then, the guy found himself in a very strange place. It was a gloomy and ancient city with many people walking down the street. Due to the large crowd, they even started to stand on their feet. On one of the streets, there was a fair selling food. There were many people in long coats and voluminous dresses who wanted to buy something. Each vendor presented their product and dish in the best way possible. Some attracted interest with beautiful poetry, and others with nice promotions. Many vendors brought out their best dishes for sale. They spoke with love and offered to choose everything to your taste. The aroma was incredible. Everything was very atmospheric and everyone was warm. Klein felt as if he had been transported back to his childhood. When he and his mother went to the market to buy food for the next week, different offers were heard from each tent. Everyone was announcing their goods. The street musicians were not only earning money, but also making a living by playing their instruments. Little boys would come to the fair to play a little prank and steal goods, thus amusing each other. But Klein tried not to be distracted by them. He thought that it was probably possible to live in any world, and fairs would always remain crowded. The boy took the money out of his coat pocket. It was all of his older brother Benson's savings. His little ego realized that no matter what world he was in or what body he was in, he would not stop loving money. But there was one problem. He was poor and didn't have any. Klein quickly snapped back to reality and decided that there was no time to think. He needed to buy food as soon as possible so that he could perform the ritual. His goal was to get back into his life. Walking down the street, he noticed a very familiar sign from a small bread shop. He was greeted warmly by Aunt Smyron, who was not only a saleswoman but also baked fragrant bread and buns herself. Klein asked her for 8 feet of Rui bread. It was his favorite because when he and his mother went to town, they always bought this pastry. While Mrs. Smyron was packing the order, she decided to ask where his brother Benson was. After all, she knew the family very well. But Klein reassured her aunt by telling her that his brother was working hard and would not be home so soon. They talked like old friends, discussing the life of the young man and his family. The woman was very happy to see the boy, because she had not seen him for a long time. Klein also kept up with his compliments. He noted that his aunt looked very good and had not aged at all. She remained the same as he remembered from his childhood. After a pleasant conversation, Mrs. Smyron packed the delicious and still warm buns in a cardboard bag and announced the price to be paid, 9 pence. Klein was very surprised because it was very cheap. He asked the saleswoman again if this was the exact price, because it had been more expensive a couple of days earlier. Aunt Smyron was a nice person and thanked me with a smile for the pleasant meeting. She said that the rules had changed and the grain laws had been canceled, so the price of bread had dropped. Klein thanked the woman and wished her a good day and moved on. He remembered that he still needed to buy lamb and peas for the meal. The young man repeated everything over and over again to make sure he didn't forget anything. Around the fair, there was an announcement about a circus performance. A young man was dressed as a clown with makeup on his face, and he held out his hand with a poster. Klein picked up the brochure to find out more about what was going to happen. He read the announcement about the circus performance. He was excited and immediately thought of his sister. The young man rushed home to tell Melissa the good news. Suddenly, behind him he heard the voice of a woman who offered him a fortune-telling. She was a local sorceress dressed in a black cloak and hat. Klein was very interested in this offer because he needed it. The sorceress was not like the others. She was incredibly beautiful. Her hair was a dark eggplant color that easily fell over her face, and her eyes were blue, like the depths of the ocean. Klein did not believe in these tricks and refused her offer. None of this inspired confidence. But the sorceress convinced him in her own words that her tarot card reading was very accurate and showed only the truth. She praised herself a lot so that Klein would use her services. When the sorceress finished her story, Klein was seriously thinking. He knew everything about the cards, every detail. As Klein was walking through the market, he saw an interesting man. It was Mr. Roselle, the inventor of steam engines and other inventions, who was speaking to the public. He became interested in the speaker's story and plunged into the past. Mr. was once recognized by the Church of the God of Craftsmanship and became the first consul of the Intis Republic. Later, he took control of the Kingdom of Lemberg and brought the Kingdom of Lowen and many other empires to their knees. After that, he declared himself Emperor Caesar. And it was during the reign of Roselle that the Church acquired its first title of public divine revelation since the 5th era. From that time on, the god of craftsmanship was changed to the god of steam and machines. So it was the inventor who came up with tarot card divination, as well as paper cards and many different games. Many of them were known to Zhou Ming Rui, such as War or Texas Poker. But at the end of his life, he was betrayed. In 1198, the Church of the Eternally Floating Sun, together with the Sauron family from the former kingdom of Intis, killed him. and he eventually died in the castle of White Maple. The young man woke up from his memories and saw the sorceress in front of him. He asked how much her vision would cost, because he had a lot of money left. The sorceress said that he was her first client, and that she would do everything for free. She took him to a tent similar to a circus to start reading tarot cards. They sat down in the dim light at a table where Klein began to ask his questions. The girl tuned into the work. The boy looked at all the cards and realized that they were indistinguishable from the earthly ones. It seemed to him even more that Mr. Roselle was an older companion in misfortune. The sorceress handed the young man a deck of cards and asked him to shuffle them so that everything would be clean and he would trust her. Klein asked again if there would be any additional charges for the reading. The sorceress calmed his worries and said that everything was free. The young man picked up a deck of cards and began to shuffle them carefully. After all the manipulations with the tarot cards, he put them on the table and set himself up for further action. The sorceress prepared for the reading and asked the boy what he wanted to know. She was very friendly and smiling towards the boy. Klein did not hesitate and laid out all his requests. He asked her to read the past, the future, and even the present. The sorceress was very surprised because she had never received such a request before. Many clients only wanted to hear about the future, their family, and even the day they would die. Then she asked the young man to shuffle the deck again and clearly express his wish for the visions. As to get a reliable prediction, you need to be sure of your question. And again, his little ego was irritated and did not understand why everyone wanted money and why there could not be anything free in this world. But Klein tuned in again and clearly stated his wishes and asked all the questions that bothered him. I asked him again if he had specified everything correctly, and then the sorceress began the whole process of divination. She pulled out the cards one by one and began to decode them. The first card represented the past. Then she slowly pulled out the second card and announced that it symbolized the present, just as Klein had wanted. And the last request was for the future. The sorceress shuffled the deck and pulled out the last card and announced what would come later. The girl finished looking for suitable cards and asked Klein which one he would like to learn about first. He looked at them carefully and had a difficult choice, but decided which one to choose first. Klein thought about his choice for a long time, but decided that his first prediction would be about the present and what to expect tomorrow. The sorceress agreed and began to read the card. She held up a card and told her what she saw in the picture. It was a jester. Klein didn't expect to see it. He realized that the card was number 0, which meant that it implied a beginning. And as soon as the sorceress began her story about the map, an unfamiliar woman burst into their tent and screamed at the girl. The sorceress was very nervous because she did not expect to see a disgruntled lady with beautiful forms. The woman ordered the imposter to return because she was only a trainer. They had a conflict because of the swindler. The real witch forced her out into the yard and reminded her that only she could tell people's fates. The woman breathed a sigh of relief and wiped the sweat from her forehead. Klein was confused by what he saw. The sorceress quickly reacted to the boy and asked him in a rude voice if he wanted her to read his fortune. Klein thought about the woman's offer, but before doing so, he asked if it would be free, because the previous offer was perfectly suitable for him. The sorceress smiled playfully and said that the guy had to pay her. Klein didn't like that, so he refused. The young man quickly ran away from that tent and went home immediately. As he walked, he couldn't stop thinking about the situation, because he didn't understand how an ordinary trainer could guess. Klein took all the money he had left out of his pocket and counted it. He realized that he had very little left. He had spent 2 souls and 1 penny on food alone. But I stopped and realized that I could easily perform my own ritual to improve my luck with these products. The young man took a torn page from the book out of his pocket to reread all the conditions and incantations once again. Klein came home and sat down at his desk to prepare. He finished translating the entire spell. He understood the language of Hermes, but it was not easy. The young man prepared all the elements for the ritual by placing loaves of bread in the 4 corners. He looked around to see if he had forgotten to do anything. The boy stood in the middle of the room, took the sheet with the text of the spell, and decided to start the task. Klein stood confidently on his feet and prayed. His lips whispered softly that the blessing of the immortal Lord of heaven and earth would descend. He stood with his eyes closed and recited the incantation again and again. The young man did not stop praying and stood in one place. His body became stony and focused on only one thing. The ritual worked because of the continuous recitation of the prayer. Klein stood in the middle of the enchanted square with bread placed in the corners. It was like a blue portal. The guy was still conscious. He had a strange thought about whether he could return to the real world, to his body. He was absorbed in his thoughts, not knowing whether it would have any effect. He was nervous that something unexpected might happen. Klein suddenly fell to his knees and held his head. He did not understand what was happening. His hands clenched and the leaf fell to the floor. The young man lay curled up in a ball. His head was exploding with pain. He imagined that a nail was being driven into his skull with a large hammer. Klein was holding his head with his hands and moaning in pain. He couldn't even open his eyes, and even worse, a strange voice was in his mind. Klein lost consciousness for a moment, falling as if to the bottom of a huge ocean because of his pain. It was as if his soul did not belong to his body. Suddenly, he barely opened his eyes, slowly regaining consciousness. He put his hand to his eyes to see if he was alive. The guy got to his feet and looked around. He did not realize where his body was. This environment was nothing like the real world. Many strange, red spots were flying around him. The young man had never seen anything like it in his life. Klein decided to touch them anyway. He was very interested and attracted by all this. After that, the young man was thrown several meters away, as if the balls were charged with electricity. They flew around, making unpleasant noises. The boy focused on his attention and tried to run away from them so as not to be hit by their discharge again. His eyes were drawn to a strange light in the distance. He turned and strained his eyes to see what was happening. Klein saw that there was a large mirror with a golden border, and behind it, he could hear a sweet girlish voice speaking strangely. She was unearthly beautiful with golden, long hair. The girl stood in front of a mirror and continuously recited a prayer that mentioned the name of the Hall family. It was Audrey Hall. Her beauty was very attractive. Her figure was like a beautiful porcelain vase holding a heavy dress. The girl held her hands together and ordered someone to wake up, and around her there was a deathly silence in the royal room. The girl had very large and green eyes, and her expression showed that she was confused about something. Audrey realized that her father had been lying to her after all. Audrey Hall said that he always said that this mirror once belonged to the Dark Emperor of the ancient Solomon's Empire, and that it was a magical treasure. But an incomprehensible thought caught the girl's attention. Her eyes became interested and a little embarrassed. She calmly approached the mirror. Suddenly, Audrey heard strange sounds coming from the mirror. Her gaze stopped and froze in one place at what she saw. A huge portal opened in the mirror and took the teenagers into a whirlpool of fantasy. They saw a large ship on the high seas. It was sailing during a storm, overcoming high waves. Audrey and Klein noticed a tall, brown-eyed boy. It was Alger Wilson. His cloak was blowing in different directions in the wind, and his hands were holding a crystalline figure in the shape of a small pyramid. He spoke quietly to his amulet about some strange thing. The boy said that it still lacked the blood of the ghost shark. The pyramid began to make strange sounds and emit incredibly bright light. Algeria was very scared, although he did not show it on his fighting face. He was worried and trying to understand what was happening. Suddenly, his ship began to shimmer as well and completely illuminated the dark night in the middle of the Black Sea. It was a fantastic sight, with sparks flying in all directions. It was Klein's landing on a planet where red charged spots were flying in the air and everything was smoky. The guy got to his feet. In the distance, he noticed two figures, a man and a woman. They stood together and were silent. The young man decided to call them. It was Audra and Alger, who were already talking to each other. The girl was also disturbed by the place. The brown-eyed man asked the teenagers what brought them to this land. Klein listened to the language spoken by the tutors, but he was confused about how he got here. I came to think that perhaps they had all been thrown into this strange place by his ritual to improve his luck. Klein did not dare to approach the young men, fearing the consequences of prayer. Perhaps he needed to open his ego and ask for specific information, but the guy wanted to do it all for himself. It was an experiment that might have helped him. Audrey and Alger were very nervous and surprised at the same time. They were angry with Klein for his stupidity that led to the problem. The young men stood and looked at the silhouette of the guy. but they did not understand whether he was really a person, because they only heard his voice, and the body itself was not visible. But Audrey approached Klein's shadow and decided to ask him what had happened, and if he could return everything to the way it was before. Everything was smoky. He could barely see who was standing in front of him and asking questions. The young man finally saw the figure of a girl with blonde, golden hair, and next to her was a tall man with blue hair. Klein still did not understand their faces, but he was sure of one thing. He was the master of this world, and they were guests. The guy thought it over and decided not to mock the young men and began to say a prayer, spreading his arms in different directions to finally send them back. It didn't take Audrey long to realize that the guy didn't want to hurt them, but rather to solve this dilemma. And all of this is really a failed experiment. Her eyes lit up. She had always wanted to feel something like this, and tried to say that she liked mysteries very much. The girl was a little detective. The girl asked the boy about being transferred to the afterlife, but Klein did not know the answer himself, although he did not show it on his face. The young man made it clear that he was the master of this world, and did not want to answer any questions. But he was confused by the fact that there was no temple with a long table in this world. Suddenly, a strange thing began to happen under their feet. The stone pavement began to rise upward, spreading at the seams and accelerating upward with rapid force. Everything began to rise to the sky with the enormous power of the subsoil. The three young men stood in the middle of this storm and did not understand what would happen next and what they should do. Audrey and Alger looked at each other and stood there in awe. It was the first time in their lives that this had ever happened. Some kind of magical power on this earth. The explosion quickly subsided and a building began to appear from the thick dust, but it was hard to see it. A few minutes later, all the dirt settled to the bottom, and the royal tower with 2 columns on top was already visible. It looked like the Colosseum in Rome. The young men went inside to find out who was there and what his goal was to seize the land. Entering the large wooden door, they saw a long table in the middle of the room. Audrey, Klein, and Alger sat down on chairs and were very surprised. It was all very majestic and huge. They could not calm their emotions. It was all strange and unreal. The guy with the blue hair convinced the others that they needed to join the Church of the Goddess of Eternal Night to become otherworldly. Or there was another church option, the God of Steam and Machines. He really knew what he was talking about. He continued to confirm the teenagers in his knowledge, saying that many people from the world did not become mystical powers, and even many priests of large churches doubt this mysticism. Alger did not stop in his stories. He was sure that the otherworldly still existed in palaces, in courts, and even in executive bodies that fought against danger. But as soon as the Iron Age began, their numbers decreased. But out of all the words he heard, he was very surprised by the phrase Iron Age, because according to his memories, this age belonged to the 5th era, which began 1,349 years later. Audrey also kept up with the discussion of knowledge. She said that she also knew about this, and knew about the Nighthawks of the Authorized Punisher. But despite this, she did not want to lose her freedom. She was confused by all this. She was angry and wondered if there was another way to solve it, because she didn't like what the guys were offering. The guys looked at each other and did not understand what other way there could be. Everything they knew and understood could be done. Algiers sorted through all the thoughts that came to his mind. He looked into the distance to concentrate somehow. Klein also did not sit idly by. He drew out all his knowledge and memories from the deepest recesses of his head to somehow solve the problem. Alger mentioned 2 sets of 9-point potion formulas. The teenagers looked at each other in surprise and did not know about such spells. But it was clear from Audrey's face that she was hiding something and still knew about it. The guy with the blue hair said they knew about it. But if they don't have such knowledge, they can only rely on potions, where their names are derived from the blasphemous tablet. And the names of these magical drinks have been translated into hundreds of languages, but have changed a lot over time. The main thing is that it's not the name, but the effect they create. Alger said that he knew one thing well, called Sailor. It gives you a great sense of balance, and besides that, your body will have large scales and allow you to swim freely like a fish. Audrey confirmed the boy's words and said that in the past he had been called the Guardian of the Sea. Her eyes were burning with curiosity and excitement. Alger went on to tell us about another potion called the Spectator. It was this spell that gave an exceptionally sharp mind and excellent observational abilities. With these skills, it was easy to follow the behavior and emotions of the play's actors and sneak a peek into the secret crevices of their minds. After hearing this, Audrey was very surprised, because she was confused by the phrase that even if you are an extravaganza at a banquet or in the middle of the street, you should always remain a spectator and not show it to others. After processing everything in her head, the girl felt that she fell in love with this potion and decided to find out where to find it and get it. She even offered to exchange a thing or knowledge for it. Alger knew the answer to this question and where to get it. He announced that he needed to find the blood of a ghost shark, namely 100 milliliters of this mystical creature. Audrey didn't think twice and agreed to these terms, but she asked if she did not get it. Was there a guarantee for this exchange? The guy reassured her and said that he would immediately send it to a certain address by mail. Alger saw that the girl was hesitating, so he suggested that Klein witness their agreement so that they could feel calm and confident. The girl was excited by this offer and asked the young man if he could help them with their dispute. But before doing so, she thought about his name, because they did not know each other. Klein thought about his pseudonym because he didn't want people to know his real name and find out who he really was. He slapped his hand loudly on the table and told us to call him Shut. Audrey and Alger looked at each other and asked his name again in surprise. They had never heard such a sophisticated and interesting yet strange name before. The girl approached with all respect, addressed her royally, and majestically asked to be their witness and guarantor of their agreement. The jester remained a human being and bowed before her, saying that he would be happy to be a witness in their performance. They thanked him very much. The guy was always smiling and did not appear to have such a high status. He suggested that his friends continue the discussion and come to a conclusion, concluding a successful deal. Alger continued that when they get the shark's blood, they will take it to the warrior and the sea bar to give it to certain people. When they complete the task, everyone can meet to pass on the potion recipe. Audrey agreed to the blue-haired young man's conditions, but noted that she wanted a hand-to-hand transfer as this was the safest way. The girl turned to Mr. Shut again to ask for another meeting because he was a witness and had to be with them. And apparently it will not happen once, but on a regular basis. Algeria also asked him if it would be very useful for him to learn about the diversity of science, and perhaps his kindness will be the very sliver of light. Audrey was listening attentively to the boy's address when she heard words that startled her. He was addressing a young person of noble blood. She wondered if her demeanor and accent had given her away. The boys were very happy that Shut agreed to help. They agreed that if the meetings were regular, he would be able to entrust them with their tasks. This would be their great gratitude. Klein began to think logically and suggested to them that during their meetings, they could learn more not only about what they knew, but also discover new secrets of the potion, to reverse rebirth. But he shouldn't have dismissed the fact that the number of meetings they would have revealed his identity, which was not to his advantage. The two friends looked at each other and their faces showed irritation and anger. Klein didn't understand Audrey and Alchem's displeasure and stopped to tap his finger on the table. After all, they needed it, not him. For the guy, these were favorable conditions and a fair exchange. Every Monday at 3 o'clock, they had to be alone for the experiment. But after that, they could choose the time themselves. The teenagers agreed and continued the conversation to discuss further. Audrey cautiously asked for his consent and suggested that they give each other code names. The girl was good at tarot cards, and her little ego suggested that she could choose names from the cards' names. She analyzed what would suit her best and chose the Justice card. Audrey continued to assign roles and asked Alchem who he saw himself as and who he wanted to be. He insulted the original name, which really describes it as the Hangman. He also suggested that since they use an old deck of tarot cards, they should call their meeting Tarot Club Meeting. Audrey was happy to support him and asked Shut if it wasn't great, and with such success they would be able to attract new members. But the gentleman said that they could solve all other issues without his approval. The girl knew that tarot cards were invented by Emperor Roselle as entertainment, and that they had no power to predict the future. Klein knew that tarot cards were a tool that had a large number of symbols and logical elements that helped to read these signs more accurately. Suddenly, his head started to hurt again. Audrey also had some interesting information that the Emperor invented another set of cards that symbolized some unknown force, which contained 22 cards and later became part of the tarot. The alchemist confirmed the girl's words and added that the set of cards contained the deep secrets of the 22 paths of divine vision. But she was very surprised by this information. Klein listened to his friends and suggested that we call it a day because there was a lot of work to be done. Audrey thanked everyone for their attention and went on to work and explore all the secrets. The commander-in-chief announced the next meeting, which did not require long waits. Suddenly, everything happened as if in a dream, and Klein saw familiar places and buildings again. He found himself back in the middle of the room and did not understand what had just happened to him. The boy thought about the visions he had. What could that gray, foggy world mean? He walked over to the table where his diary was kept and wondered what kind of force had led to such strange events. His attention was drawn to his father's watch, which was repaired by his sister Melissa. Klein picked it up and checked the present tense. He came to the conclusion that time in that world was the same. But the meeting was truly mysterious and enigmatic. The young man began to recall everything that happened then. He realized that they lived in different parts of the world, but despite the great distance, they could easily communicate. The boy remembered his diary and went to the table to find the solution to this mystery. After reading his notes, he breathed a sigh of relief that it was now only Klein and not Zhou Mingrui. And as soon as the boy closed his eyes, he returned to the mysterious ship where the miracles took place. Klein had a bewildered look on his face and stood there wondering how it all happened. Later, he realized that he had to fulfill the alchemist's task. He stood again with the amulet in his hands in the middle of the deck and twisted all his thoughts and considered how he had gotten back there again. Suddenly, the glass pyramid began to crack in the young man's palms, making strange sounds, while Klein just held it and did nothing. A second later, it completely split into many small particles and fell to the ground with a crash. The young man stood there, fascinated, watching. After everything fell down, Klein carefully lifted his hand and began to look at it, because he felt some unpleasant sensations. The guy saw a small cut on his palm from which blood began to flow. Klein did not think much about it. A long, dark corridor appeared in front of him, and he decided to go into it and investigate the situation. He stood there with a formidable look, showing that he was not afraid of anything and was ready for anything that happened in this world. A Russian boy with a black eye patch appeared in front of him. They stood next to each other, touching shoulders. The boys leaned back to back, raising their fists to their hearts and recited a spell, as if to say that the storm would come with them. After all these words, Klein suddenly found himself in a mysterious room where a young man with long blonde hair and dressed in pirate clothes was sitting in front of him. The boy was angry with him because he did not want to obey his words and wishes, but he assured the young man that he could handle it and that everything would work out. The pirate tried to convince him that the case was not his responsibility and that he was powerless, citing many arguments to somehow smooth out his guilt. Suddenly, a hand flew into his neck with great force. It happened so fast that the boy did not have time to realize what had happened. Klein pinned the pirate to the wall with such fury that the wall even cracked. He was furious and could no longer tolerate the fact that he was not listened to, he was in charge. Continuing his hatred for the boy, he stuck out a long and sharp claw and stabbed him in the neck. His eyes blazed with rage. The pirate felt a sharp claw climb into his artery and his eyes rolled up in pain. Suddenly he felt that he could no longer feel the ground under his feet. Klein used all his strength to lift his ward with one hand and finish him off. Black blood from the blonde boy's neck flowed down his boots, rather than leave the pirate's dead body on deck. The young man decided to simply throw it into the clear sea to end it forever. Klein found some kind of a cloth to wipe his hands of blood and hide all traces. He stood quietly, staring at the hole in the wall that the drone had blasted through. Suddenly, a young man appeared behind him, and he was casting spells with him. The chief noted that it seemed as if the ship's captain had escaped and had no otherworldly power left. The young men spoke as if they were old acquaintances who realized that they would be rewarded for taking over this ghostly ship, and that the others were just figures. Klein continued to argue that the storm could end quickly and that the captain who had seemingly escaped would not be able to hold out for long. After all the circumstances that happened on deck, the guy knew that a new era would come. After that, the events moved to Audrey Hall's room, where she stood in the middle of the room and listened intently to her thoughts. She walked over to the surface of the table, where there were shards of glass, and on her hand there were small cuts, as if they had damaged the skin. Audrey saw everything and realized that it was not a dream after all, but that all the events that happened to her were actually real. Then she had a brilliant idea that she wanted to realize. She picked up her long dress from the ground and prepared to kneel down. The girl carefully lay down on the floor to pretend she was asleep and remember all the events that had happened. Suddenly, a loud knock on the door disturbed her thoughts. She quickly and anxiously got to her feet. Audrey asked from afar who could be disturbing her, because she hadn't expected anyone. From the big door came the soft voice of a girl who introduced herself as Annie. She asked if she could come in, while the girl hurriedly opened the door to the room for her. Annie was Audrey's maid who took care of the castle. She quietly entered again, asking for permission. The girl was fond of her and gladly allowed it. She asked with a pleasant smile what had happened and what the purpose of the visit was. Annie said in an embarrassed voice that she needed to prepare for certain circumstances. Audrey noticed the broken glass lying on the floor. She was unhappy and upset by what she saw, but her anger didn't last long when she realized who had done the damage. It was Susie the dog, who has a little bit of a knack for causing chaos and disorder. Annie suggested removing the dangerous glass particles and advised to train the puppies better, as they can be quite disobedient. After cleaning the room, the girls moved to the place where Audrey was doing her makeup. The maid asked her which dress to bring. The girl wanted to wear the gift from Miss Guinea. Annie did not approve the young woman's proposal because the dress had already been worn several times in a row and would not be suitable for a formal ceremony, which could mean that the Hall family was poor. The assistant suggested that she could wear it at home or at other less important events. Audrey agreed and ordered another gift from Mr. Sades with drawings of a lotus. Annie smiled and agreed with the girl's taste. Another maid came over and together they began to prepare the little princess for the ceremony. They laced up the bodice of the dress and smoothed the golden hair. Suddenly their idyll was interrupted by a knock on the wooden door. An important man in a serious suit and hat came in. He majestically told Audrey that it was time for them to leave. It was her father, who gently called her a little pearl. The girl challenged him and asked him not to call her that. She was already completely ready to leave. The man agreed and called her a princess. Then he raised his hand to help her to come to him and leave in the fastest way possible. Audrey was a bit moody. She didn't want to walk on the left side. She told me to go to the right. The father loved his daughter very much, so he agreed with her choice. The girl told him the reason for her whims. The left side was her mother's, a countess, so she could not take it. The man agreed and supported the proposal. The family traveled to attend the ceremony. They arrived on Dubovoy Island at the Royal Navy base. After a long journey, we arrived in our carriage to a certain place where the whole action was taking place. Audrey looked around and saw the full scale of the island. She was incredibly impressed and interested. Her attention was drawn to the large chimneys, which were smoking dark smoke and making loud sounds of vaporization. It was a huge ship, the size of the Titanic, compared to the other yachts that were near it. On deck were many cannons that were loaded for safety. Many people who were supposed to travel on it stood and looked at the ship with great surprise and admiration. Audrey was overwhelmed by the size. The girl saw the size and said in a frightened voice that it was an armored warship. All the guests went on deck to begin the journey and the official ceremony. Suddenly, a big black hole appeared in the sky above their heads. People were incredibly frightened by what they saw. Everyone was throwing out their own phrase with suggestions as to what it could be. The hole was getting bigger and bigger, heading toward the ship. From the inside, I could hear thunder as if a lord was coming down to earth. Audrey could not help but assume that it was in this era that the paladin punishers of the highest order came. And this was a huge airship descending. It descended with incredible speed to the ship, filling the transparent sky with its dark bottom. Figures in iron armor and men in identical costumes from the kingdom's era descended from a huge airship. They were joined by the chief ruler, Lowen Georg III. His attire was elegant and expensive, befitting his position. The captain of this ship presented the king with all the characteristics of this machine. He said that the transport was equipped with various equipment and speed. The guests surrounded the storyteller, listening attentively. This liner later became a real hegemon and conqueror of the seas. The narrator noticed the king and did not know how to address him. He bowed down to him and asked for his name to have a conversation in the future. The king did not think twice and introduced himself as Pritz, because Pritz Harbert was sailing from harbor. After the name was announced, all the guests and visitors of the ship began shouting and praising him. Fireworks were launched into the sky, and the ship's captain was quite upset because the era would end, and all the ghosts would disappear, and the seas would be empty and contain only armored military decks. He heard the people talking and became irritated. They were discussing and arguing about why their boards couldn't build such machines themselves. The guests could be heard exclaiming and expressing their dissatisfaction. They didn't understand why no one would be able to build new private ships if pirates captured such armored ships. But there were other opinions and clamor that large airliners would require large expenditures from poor people. The chief continued to reassure and tell us that construction work had begun and that a lot of materials and manpower had been brought in. He said that the era of firearms and giant ships had begun. Now no pirates will take over the world. The events were transferred to Klein, who carefully studied the incidents in his diary. He looked down at his hand, which had 4 specks around the perimeter of the square. The guy remembered his unfinished rituals. He thought that now, with these dots, in the future he would be able to perform ceremonies without food and preparation. Klein, on the one hand, was delighted with this power, but because he did not understand how it happened, he was scared. He lay down on his bed and thought for a second about his condition. After all, fear has long been known to be the strongest emotion of mankind. Closing my eyes, I realized that the fear of the unknown is the worst and most frightening thing. Suddenly, Klein slowly opened his eyes and scratched the back of his head. He realized that it was all a dream and not even a bad one. But the only thing that bothered him was his head. The guy opened his old watch and looked at the time. 3 hours had passed, and time was passing almost as fast as on the ground in another consciousness. Then his concentration was interrupted by the rumbling of his stomach. He was hungry. The young man looked around the room and saw the bread in the corner with which he performed his ritual. Klein was worried about the state of his life. Would he have to eat a moldy loaf of bread in the morning, lunch and dinner, and only occasionally meat? Then he stopped and realized that he remembered one action. The young man took the plate of bread in his hands and wanted to demonstrate his reborn power. Because he was hungry, he didn't think twice about it and started cooking dinner. He took the potatoes to wash them. Klein was a good cook and skillfully prepared delicious food for himself. The young man put everything beautifully on the plate and could not get enough of his skills. He could smell the goodness of the dinner. He took the hot and fragrant potatoes and lifted them to his mouth to cool them down as quickly as possible. The young chef took his first bite and melted with the taste. It brought back memories of his mother's cooking. When he was a child, he would always take a bun in one hand and a potato in the other and dip it into a plate of gravy or just the juice of his own dish. He liked it so much that he drank every last drop and licked up all the residue. After finishing the meal, he put the plate on the table with satisfaction. Klein leaned on the back of his chair and burped like a real guy. He felt great and refreshed, but after eating his meal, he had almost no energy left. The guy pulled himself together and forced himself to do something after a good dinner. He realized that he had been reborn and would not be able to return to his previous life. The main thing is to find the time and the way to become otherworldly. Klein's best solution was to keep a diary where he found clues for the next meeting and answers to questions. Since he had been reborn, he wanted to learn more and deal with the problem of life. The guy was worried about why he committed suicide and what led to it. Perhaps there were mental traumas that he could not cope with. The present-day Klein continued to read his diary. Turning the pages, he came across an interesting story about 3 young men who were talking about the discovery of a manuscript from the 4th century. The young man was surprised to hear about this era because it might have been the Iron Age. He could not come to a definite opinion. He had a lot of knowledge, but this period was still mysterious. He found out that Klein had been a student of history, and when he learned even more new information about the 4th era, he became even more excited. But could the news that he invented about the mysterious day be connected to his death? The researcher took the matter seriously and began to address this question by looking for it in the diary. The young man read thoughtfully a story that had been passed down through the teenagers. They knew that the writer of the manuscript had a goal of climbing to the top of the Hornacis Ridge so that the muse would appear there to continue writing. All the records were sold, and everything ended on June 28, which meant that it was during this period that he was reborn. The boy flipped through the diary in confusion to find the next clue. He was sure that the previous Klein had an entry on June 27th. On the next page, he saw a death warning in large black lettering across the entire page. Then he quickly closed the notebook. Klein was fixated on the fact that there are very few universities in this world that are far from each other and only nobles can study. The boy decided to continue reading the diary and came across a conversation between the young men who were talking about Welch, the banker's son, who studied with them in the group. It was as if the researcher had been stung by a wasp and jumped away, remembering that they were friends and that he needed to meet with the young man to review the manuscripts again. But the thought that events were developing so enchantingly and mysteriously that he no longer knew what to expect next and whether there might be danger was frightening. He had his doubts, but decided not to give up on his experiment, because if he did, he would never learn the details of the suicide. He stood by the window and thought about the situation, when suddenly his peace was disturbed by a knock at the door. The young man came closer and asked who could have bothered him. He opened his door but saw no one. The sound of knocking echoed throughout the corridor. Klein closed the door and walked away from them when a second later he heard the clatter again. He took out an old pistol from his desk to protect himself from danger. When he approached the door, he stopped hearing the strange sounds again. This made him very worried and annoyed. The young man was nervous because he did not understand what was happening. He thought that someone was mocking him. He stood quietly by the door and loaded his pistol in case of another knock and reacted quickly. He tuned in and suddenly heard a voice. It was a man who introduced himself as Bitch Mountbatten. The police visited Klein and he was very nervous. He quickly went to hide the gun and told the police that he was on his way to them. The young man hid the weapon in a safe place so that no one would find it. He nervously adjusted the collar of his shirt, combed his hair, and prepared for the unexpected meeting. He hid his pistol in the fireplace, hoping that it would not be searched. Klein headed for the door and opened the order. He pretended to have just woken up and yawned deliciously in front of the officers. But his gaze was stopped by one thing he could not take his eyes off. In front of him stood many large men with beards on their faces. They were dressed in official clothes with police elements. The chief policeman introduced himself and said that the other 3 inspectors wanted to ask him something. He anxiously invited the officers to his room and asked what they wanted to talk to him about. Klein noticed the men's outfits. One of them had epaulets on his jacket with 6 stars on them. He really did not know what it meant and why these people were in his apartment. Were they really inspectors? They started talking and the guy asked if he knew a guy like Welch McGovern. Klein got worried and asked what happened to his friend. But the officer did not answer the question, but began to ask more questions of his own. The guy was seriously scared, and it was obvious to the naked eye. The policeman tried to calm him down and asked him not to worry. The policeman put a black glove on his hand and warned that this was a standard questioning procedure that everyone goes through. The young man decided to calm himself down and took a deep breath through his nose to focus on his words. He tuned in and said that he actually knew Welch. They were classmates and studied at the university under the same mentor, Senior Associate Professor Quentin Cohen. The officer thought about the boy's words. Klein went on to say that he had a good relationship with a friend and studied together about the 4th era, which he had written about. But again, he asked if he was okay. The policeman replied very briefly and concisely that everything was fine, but as if there was something wrong with his tone. He continued and bowed his head in front of the boy, saying that his friend Welch had died. Suddenly, it was as if boiling hot water had been poured on his skin. He was not prepared for this information. He also had a girlfriend, Nye, and immediately asked about her. But unfortunately, she was also dead. They were found in Mr. Welch's house. Everything seemed to break inside the guy. He stood there and whispered to the officers, asking if they had been killed, and he rejected the idea. As strong as the policemen were, informing their families about the deaths was the hardest part. He began to describe his research and pointed out the evidence of the deaths. It was a suicide. Mr. Welch hit his head against the wall many times, most likely because there was blood everywhere, and Miss Naya just drowned in the sink where they washed their faces. Klein could not accept what he heard, but the police performed an autopsy and found the presence of drugs or the influence of some force. The guy was very concerned about this information. The officers nodded their heads to each other as if to warn them to ask further questions. The policeman asked when they last saw each other. The guy said that they had studied a new chapter of the manuscript on June 26th. After that, Klein went home to prepare for an interview at the history department on July 3rd. Suddenly, during the conversation, he noticed another policeman approaching the table where his diary was. The officer approached the notebook to examine it more closely. Klein shouted at him to put the diary back, as it was his own property, which should not be taken without the owner's permission. The policeman reassured him and said that all this was necessary for some additional procedures. The guy became increasingly irritated and began to doubt the competence of the officers, as they did not even present a search warrant. Also, the royal police system was established only 16 years ago. Suddenly, one of the policemen asked the young man about one thing he did not expect to hear. He opened the diary to a certain page with cryptic inscriptions that only the author understood. The hieroglyphics were in a language they did not speak, so he asked what it said. They were announcing a death. Klein quickly had to think of something to tell the police. After all, death is a normal human occurrence and there is nothing unusual about it. He had to speak confidently and mysteriously in favor of the police. The guy took his head in his hands because he did not know what to do and what story to tell. He froze for a second and realized that he had forgotten something important that had happened over the past few days and what those notes meant. The young man came to the conclusion that it was better to be honest and tell the truth, but to be very careful with the stories. But I wondered whether the officers would believe this fantastic story. The officer was very angry with the boy. He didn't believe his story and that he didn't remember anything. It was more reasonable to imagine that the young man had gone mad. But Klein assured the police that he was telling the truth and had nothing to lie about. The other officer still believed the boy and said that an expert would visit him in a few days and help him regain his lost memories. The young man was very surprised that they believed him so easily and could easily help him with his problem. At the same time, he was worried about the expert's skills, because she could find out about his memories of the land, and he didn't want to know. After all the examinations in Klein's room, the officers thanked him for his cooperation and asked him not to leave the city in the coming days. Otherwise, he would be convicted. The young man agreed to the terms and conditions and confirmed that he would do everything properly. The policeman said goodbye and headed for the exit, but Klein was very surprised that they did not arrest him to find out more information. One of the officers smiled amusedly and said that the guy had a good personality. He added that usually those who faced such events also die, and everyone is happy to see him alive for further investigation. After all the talks, the police wished him all the best and closed the door. Klein was very confused after the man's words. He did not understand what it meant that everyone involved in the game was dying, why he was still alive, and why he was lucky. The young man could not come to the right conclusion and walked away from the door. The guy thought if everything was so terrible, why didn't they provide him with protection in the form of a guard? Were they just testing him or using him as bait? He rushed to the door before the policeman could leave to ask them if they would protect him. Unfortunately, they didn't answer Klein's question, leaving in a whisper. He didn't know what to do or think anymore. His little ego was angry inside. He didn't know how to react to this situation, and his acting skills left much to be desired. After all the events, Klein recovered a bit and decided to hide the weapon in a safe place under his bed. He made a hole in the wooden wall and forced the gun in. When he finished his work, he remembered that his sister Melissa was coming over soon to cook lamb stew with tender peas. But cooking is all about playing with flavors and adding seasonings, and they were not very rich to support themselves. Melissa was too young to be a good cook. Klein realized that it was still a long time before his sister would arrive, at 8:30 in the evening. After a hard day, she would be tired and hungry. Then the guy decided to surprise Melissa himself and show her his cooking skills and talents. The young man began to create a masterpiece in his opinion. First, he took a green onion and cut it into slices. He added vegetables to the boiling soup. The aroma of dinner spread throughout the apartment. Suddenly, he was interrupted by his sister who came into the room. She praised her brother for the incredible smells that were spreading everywhere. Klein quickly poured dinner onto his plate and welcomed Melissa back. The girl was very surprised at what she saw in front of her, because her brother had never cooked. There was a fragrant dinner with crispy loaves on the table. The young man confirmed that he had cooked everything himself without any other help and invited the girl to dinner, wishing her a good appetite. Melissa was a little shocked by her brother's skills. She picked up her fork to try the food anyway. She carefully brought a piece of meat to her mouth. Her pupils dilated several times, and her taste buds exploded from the incredible flavor. It was the most delicious meat she had ever tasted. Melissa lost herself in her thoughts with pleasure. It was so delicious, tender, juicy that she could not contain her emotions. She was chewing with all 32 teeth and looked like a hamster trying to eat food quickly. At the time, Klein was just enjoying this painting, like a sister enjoying her food. After he chewed his food, Melissa asked him why he didn't eat dinner with her. He replied that he was full while cooking. The sister was a little unhappy that she was eating alone, but the boyfriend reassured her and suggested that they continue eating. Melissa thanked him and asked where he had learned to cook so well. The young man said that he had once visited Welch and asked his chef for the recipe. Klein did not praise himself and said that his friend's chef cooks the best. He would earn money and take Benson to the restaurant. Melissa decided to ask him how he was preparing for the interview. Suddenly, after a delicious dinner, the girl suddenly burped loudly, which shocked her. Klein laughed softly so as not to embarrass the girl because it was all natural and normal. The guy asked for a deal that he would cook a delicious dinner and his sister would wash the dishes afterwards. Melissa never objected and agreed, and it was not a big deal for her. A few minutes later, the dishes were shining with cleanliness. The girl went to the cupboard to put the plates away and noticed strange things there. She saw 3 jars with different mixtures inside, which was very interesting because she had never seen anything like it before. Melissa asked if he added black pepper and fat. Klein replied that he had, but only a little, because it added a fantastic flavor to the dish. The girl didn't like it very much, so she suggested that she cook while he concentrated on preparing for the interview. But Klein didn't understand why she was bringing up this topic now. It was a dark and deep night, and the moon was rising higher and higher. Klein was still working and studying the history of the diary, and Mela said goodnight and went to rest from a hard day. He also did not stay up late, turned off the light, and went to bed. As soon as Klenya fell into a sweet sleep, someone knocked on the door and disturbed him. He did not understand what was happening and thought he had overslept. The guy asked who it could have been. Through the door came the rough voice of a man who introduced himself as Dunn Smith, but Klein did not know him. He opened the door and saw a policeman who had already visited him. He did not understand why he would visit him. The officer provided information that Klein was with them at the time of Welch's murder, and it was the mister who paid for his carriage to his residence. Suddenly, the guy put the puzzle together with suicide. After all, the 27th is the date of the death of the 3 friends. But he could not say this to the officer, and his speech stopped. The young man began to defend his honor and argued that he had nothing to do with Welch's death. He wants to know the truth as much as anyone else. Klein seemed to be at a crossroads and did not know what to say next. He really didn't remember much, and what he did know was from his diary. This was very upsetting to him. The officer noted that the guy had good self-control and could keep himself in check. The guy didn't know how to react to this, whether it was a compliment or a mockery. The policeman went into the room, and the young man assured him that everything he said was true. The officer reported that a revolver was not found in Welch's house. The man wanted to search the rooms to find weapons. It was then that Klein realized where he had gotten the gun. It was Welch that very night, but the guy did not object and accepted that they would search him. Klein decided not to hide the lie and told where the gun was. The policeman was bewildered by what he saw. He did not expect to find out the truth so easily and why he was hiding it. The guy began to calm the man down and said that he would tell everything as it was. The young man told us about the events of the next few days, about his injury and his likely death with rebirth, and he really did not remember anything. The guy was worried that they wouldn't believe him, but after such a problem, he told everything in detail. The officer slowly began to understand the guy, and all the arguments were coming together. But the only thing he didn't understand was how he could survive after such an injury. Klein breathed a sigh of relief and thanked them for believing him, but suddenly the officer broke their peace and moved on to another topic. The man said he wanted to bring the boy to an expert to learn more about him. The policeman asked the boy to go with him to the police station to continue the investigation. This could take 2 or 3 days. He was worried that so many problems had fallen on his shoulders and that the expert had returned so quickly. The man asked him to speed up and walk with him. Klein asked to wait a couple of minutes so he could leave a note. The young man sat down at the table and thought about the situation. He was nervous that the expert might know about his transformation and could lead to a court-martial. It was hard for him to concentrate on the note. His thoughts were only about police officers, guns, and death. Klein wrote a letter and calmed down, accepting the situation and acting on it. They went to the police station. The men arrived at their destination and got out of the carriage. I heard men shouting in the street. They were arguing and fighting loudly because of a thief in town. The horses roared at the loud sounds. Then he had an incredible thought. This is his chance to escape. He started running fast so that no one would notice him during the argument. And he would not talk to the expert. Klein hid behind a corner and stopped to catch his breath. He didn't understand how the guy who had committed the theft had gotten there in that second. He decided that he needed to go to Banklud to hide there. He moved along the street and thought about how best to escape. The young man realized that if he could jump into the carriage, he could throw the police off track and make it take longer to find him. Klein politely asked the carriage driver to take him to the coast at the end of the city. The coachman whipped the horses to set off. The boy looked out a small window to see the road. Suddenly, from what he saw, he did not understand where they were. The carriage was traveling fast, and the places were changing with incredible speed. Klein was watching the road and decided to ask the driver where they were going, because the coast was in the other direction. The coachman confidently replied that they were heading to the Welch residence. The guy was nervous. Suddenly, the driver lifted his black hat from his face and an officer appeared to detain the boy. When Klein woke up, it was a dream. He calmed down and went to the window to confirm that it was still night. The guy picked up his watch to check the time. It was only 3:30 in the morning. The young man went to the bathroom to wash his face and wake up from the nightmare. Klein went to the bathroom and replaced the figure that had frightened him. A tall man in a black coat stood by the window. The boy immediately realized who it was. It was really Dan Smith, as if from his dream. The young man stopped in his tracks and could not move from what he saw. He nervously swallowed his saliva and pinched himself to check if he was awake. The officer tipped his hat and introduced himself again. The man politely greeted me by saying his name, and he was also called Nighthawk. Klein was disturbed by the nickname. After all, it was once used to refer to a group of otherworldly people from the Church of the Goddess of Eternal Night. The boy cautiously asked if the officer was watching his dreams. He replied that he had only sneaked into them and made a few changes, but he knew that ordinary people cannot control other people's thoughts and dreams. Suddenly, the young man realized that during his sleep he was thinking properly and had a clear head, with which he thought consciously. But the only thing that reassured him was that the officer saw only what Klein wanted to show him in his dream. After some quick thinking, the boy turned to Mr. Smith and asked if he really believed everything he had said. The officer stood there as if he could not say a word. The only thing that surprised him was that Klein also believed that he was able to get into his dreams. After all, in the past, other people could not accept this. But he hoped that the policeman's abilities could help him. Mr. Smith kept wondering how Klein managed to survive the shot. The officer believed the boy's words that he did not remember anything, especially the day Welch was killed. The boy asked if he could go home, but the policeman forbade him to do so and said that he still had to meet with the expert. Klein shouted in frustration, asking why he could not return home. He asked the officer if he was really not convinced of his dream. The guy knew that the expert could be an expert in hypnosis. The policeman calmed the young man down and said that the doctor knew better about the human psyche and would be able to help him with his memories. Klein did not understand why he needed it. Suddenly, Mr. Smith broached the subject of Welch's manuscripts and records of the Fourth Era. They were not found in the house. The young man was the only clue in the investigation, because all the others were dead. Klein was very surprised by the disappearance of the manuscript of the Fourth Epic. The officer invited him to go to the Welch residence to meet with an expert. Klein wanted to run away, but he realized that all these people were otherworldly, so there was no way to hide from them. They will find you even in your sleep. The young man also guessed that the policeman was carrying a gun. On the way to the residence, the policeman asked the boy why he wanted to run away at the end of the dream. He was afraid that he might be a criminal after all. The guy asked if after the interrogation they did not find any evidence, would he be able to go free? The officer replied that he might. Klein was confused by the policeman's uncertain phrase. The young man asked if there had ever been such cases before. Mr. Smith confirmed that some criminals committed suicide because they could not confess to the truth. The officer claimed that he had dealt with respectable people with good financial standing, but a few years ago he hanged himself in his office. Klein was confused by this information. Suddenly, the horse's hooves began to stop, and the coachman announced that they had arrived at their destination. Mr. Smith got out first and invited Klein to come out with him and walk to the Welch residence. It was a large, beautiful estate with an iron gate. The officer asked the boy to tell him about his skills as an expert. He was the best spiritual medium in the county of Alva. They approached the front door to open the house. When they entered the room, there was an incredibly beautiful girl with black hair sitting in front of them. It was indeed a Delhi expert. She politely greeted the gentleman. Mr. Smith asked if she had found out anything about the dead. She replied that the souls had already disappeared. The man was not happy. He expected to learn something. The officer introduced Delhi to Klein and asked her to find out something about him. The girl looked admiringly at the boys with her green, big eyes. Her beauty fascinated everyone around her. Klein was nervous and realized that she had great powers and had learned a lot about him. He had no other arguments to defend himself. Then she asked for a little help. She was holding strange flasks with a filling in her hands. She wanted to perform a ritual. With a pleasant smile, the girl offered Klein to inhale the aromas to further relax and not be distracted by anything. Klein's inner ego was very worried and felt somehow threatened. The officer calmed the guy down and said that their ladies could easily relax the man. This is all the power of the Stormlord's church. The young man did not show his nervousness, but he did not know what to say next. He did not know about such methods. The policeman said that Delhi was not like that. She was more interested in corpses. The girl laughed at being labeled a pervert. The expert offered to start the ritual. She took one of the flasks in her hands and introduced the name of the fragrance. She noted that it was one of the most pleasant smells. The glue sat there like a spell. The name of the solution was Eye of the Spirit. She carefully heated it over a burning candle. Delhi pointed out that you need to add spells to everything. The girl kept talking about this broth, and Klein's thoughts were already up in smoke. His body became cottony, and his thoughts slowed down. He compared it to when he performed a ritual to improve his luck. The only thing that encouraged him was that his head was not torn apart by pain. When the girl was convinced that the young man was semi-conscious, she decided to introduce herself. She was a spiritual medium.